So I went to BCS Houston and took Shiranui for standard. So let's talk about that. Check out Dueling Guard's deck boxes, playmats, and binders. The great quality products that are anime based. They continually have more anime options becoming available. Use the affiliated link in the description for a 5% discount on your next purchase. Kinda last minute, Duke Cardfight and I actually decided to go to BCS Houston as one of the regionals that were upcoming. Special thanks to the people that really made it very accommodating and also very welcoming. So thank you for all the people that went up to me and said hi, take some pictures, make some memories, even just go play some games against each other too. And special thanks to Will Peng, Brandon, Peter, Johnny, and then also Sean for being so accommodating, even with like my flight being missed at first, and even just driving us around outside of the event too. So you guys went above and beyond, so thank you. The judges also did a really phenomenal job for the events, so there was no conflict with me whatsoever. But onto the deck profile, I'm gonna speak it as more of like a matchups type of deal. This is not Def Shiranui deck profile in sense. I've already done a deck profile like this, and it's very similar to my prior list anyway. For the expected metagame, I thought of like Shoujo Doji, Leonor, the new stuff like Impladio, and a little bit of G deck sets still, just roaming around essentially. Personally, I feel very confident in my ability with Shiranui, especially this whole year I've been playing it, and have seen results with it too, that I felt pretty confident just going into it. In fact, I felt more confident in standard than I did with premium. That says a lot. Also with the pricing too, with this season, top 32 gets the energy generators now too, and then this one was the now for the USA. So if you guys want to see that, a little glimpse of it too, it's really nice actually too. There were some people that already sold theirs at the event, and it was somewhere around like 700 to 800 bucks, which is kind of crazy. It's expected to go down once there's more floating around in the market essentially, but I decided to keep mine because one, I like it too, but secondly, somebody reminded me that like, hey, you earned that. You know, you fought for it technically. So starting off with the run line, the starter is the same. You have to pick the same run line no matter what. The Crest Giver, and of course, Genkai is. Remember that we can't use the Shoujo Doji grade 2, so it's been like that for a while too. This card is really helpful, especially in those niche cases where your opponent may like clear the board before giving you the stride turn essentially. And so that way you can call this out and call something on their board and be able to dominate right off the back. This also can come up as a booster that's 10k, so this makes magic numbers with cards like Esperidia, or even behind the Vanguard, depending on if you already have boosters for the rigid columns too. Shiranui Bow is your red, and of course dominate, do shenanigans. And again, later on, you want to revive Riggards if they clear themselves later on as well too. To knock out the stride zone for Magantembu, of course, this is like the stride I went into 9 times out of 10 with the event. The main reason is because, one is because you want to flip another card in the G zone to increase the power of the crest. This is super impactful, especially if you have restanders, so each attack does have the additional 5k. Furthermore, this also can retire annoying Riggards too, so like against Leonor, for example, even in Palio, they have these grade 2s that they really rely on, and not only you get to dominate them to make numbers still, you get to get rid of them too. The other side we have is Makuro. So Makuro you really don't go into unless you're starting for a second restander. You are CB-less during that turn, late game essentially. Or in my case, I face 2 Yotsuba Nakano decks, and that's basically like the equivalent of Exodia, but in Vanguard. And they need to get a bunch of the different quintuplets, a total of 7, but they need a total of 14 cards in the memory, and they just win the game when it's the beginning of the right phase essentially, kind of like Omega Glendios in that sense. During those matchups, I was actually kept at 0 damage the whole time, and this is standard, so there's no grade 3 heal to give yourself a damage or anything like that. You're legit stuck at 0. So then Makuro has the ability to shine a little more to get more dominations, but also more potential triggers, and just have a better turn that you could do without a Magantembu without CB at this point. It's not later on until we get the Shiranui order that makes that Magantembu turn CB-less. So that's what we got to work with. I am actually very excited for that new order moving forward once we get it too. Also, Black Friday is coming up this weekend, and so take advantage of 50 card shop and other the affiliate links too below. Dueling Guard is also having some stuff coming up soon. Keep an eye out for that too as well. Any support goes to the channel, so thank you. Now to the main deck, we have 2 more Oboros. Essentially, this is for Makuro. It's just another grade 3 to be able to stride as well. And if you ever face Prism, you can rewrite Shiranui as a way to give yourself soul immediately, especially if you want all the effort to empty out your soul the prior turn too. Bracing Angel Ladder is still really good. There's quite a few decks that try to remove your board. Shoujo Doji is one example. The mirror match with Shiranui, this prevents domination. There's also Prism. There was actually a few Prism players. I know one of them was there and playing there. I didn't face any this weekend, but they were like right next to me. And so there's just like instances where like this protection is very appreciated. In worst case scenario, it's just an Upstart Goblin, which you do appreciate the extra soul as well. I am still rocking the 4 Peeling Dragon with 4 Esperidia. So the reason for this, again, you have situations where they try to empty your board, or where your opponent tries to empty their board. Also, some people were playing Bracing Angel Ladder. That actually did come up half my games on Saturday and a few games on Friday too. And in all those cases, Esperidia was very helpful in having 1 or 2 restanders readily available to make my turns still pretty good. Trust me, I made my opponents, I was like, oh, he had the Esperidia. I'm like, yeah, because I'm playing 4. Furthermore, it makes Peeling Dragon actually a 15k shield. So if you're having these Peeling Dragons that can accumulate in your hand, they're not dead cards totally. This is another reason why I don't have to necessarily play like more defensive cards, such as like the Blitz Order with the dinosaur. So in a way, these are separate like 15ks, and that way I could still play other cards too. This can change if you wanted to. It doesn't have to be this way, but this is the reason, and I value that the most. It just happens that where I face a lot of players that know how to play against Shiranui, and so it's just having like the 4 Esperidias and the 4 Peeling Dragons just to be able to maximize on that. I did have one of my matches, like round 7 in Swiss, I remember playing against Shoto Doji, and it was Michael, and I got to discard 1 Peeling Dragon for the write-up, and then I had 2 extras in my hand, and then I pitched them for stride. So I drew a total of 3 new cards just with like during the right phase essentially, which helps like digging deeper into the actual pieces that you want to use, such as like your restanders. The retire aspect of Peeling Dragon did not come up this weekend, but it's always there just in case. But the Esperidia did come up. It's just an annoying 18k on the first stride, and then later on it will scale to 28k in most cases, which hits over a 15k guard, which forces most likely 2 card guards as well still. And then worst case scenario, I just discard this for stride. I've considered Sekai many times too, and I've considered playing like just 1 as well. But again, there's only so much room. And Sekai is the worst restander practically because he's ideally well on turn 4 moving forward. And he also has to see a domination still. So I'd rather have Esperidia that doesn't care about the dominations if they happen or not. For Furai, this is your main restander. This is the one that you really want to maximize. 2 Magen Tenbu, 2 dominations with Magen Tenbu and Oboro combined gives it a +10, and then the crest gives it another 5. This already hits over a trigger of being 25k essentially. So you can have your weaker restander if it's an Esperidia, and then if they hit a trigger, this guy can still hit without using the booster immediately. And then when your Vanguard attacks and stands these, then you can use the whole columns to hit for bigger numbers that way. For the Energy Cycler, it's just very consistent. This is one of the cards that I actually mulligan as a priority to, especially if you're going second. You're going to draw 3 cards, 1 for your starter, 1 for the crest, and 1 for this by using that energy immediately. And it just makes your deck a lot more consistent on seeing those pieces early on, especially for the early game. For Sword and Sun, this is very vital for the early game. I try to push and also take advantage of cards like Shinri, and then sometimes you have a lucky Soul Charge. Like, for example, you may think like a restander being Soul Charge is bad, and it's 1 less to draw. It's 1 less to hard draw essentially, but like you can use another copy of Sword and Sun later on to just grab it in your opponent's. Like, you can do that. You can grab your restander from your soul. So that's actually pretty cool, and it did come up one of my matches too. Also, it's kind of annoying that it gets +5k, so it's a 15k hitter. If this is unboosted, this is forcing a 10k against your opponent just for this 1 attack, and it really puts them in a position where, do I really want to drop 2 cards early on, or a high value shield, or just take the damage? If you put this with a Shinri, this actually becomes a 28k column, so that's very big, and it's typically my 2nd or 3rd attack on turn 2, so that way in most cases you get over 2 triggers as well. With the Great Ones, 4 copies of Shinri, this is another card that I wanted a mulligan for. This is a card you can easily call on turn 1 when you attack, making 21k the Vanguard column essentially, and then it will go into Soul and draw a card. Later on, you can use Bracing Angel Ladder, so that way, regardless if your opponent has more than 1 Rigard, you can still Soul Charge it and take advantage of the power-up too. And also keep in mind that the power-up is beneficial, but put it into Soul and draw a card is optional. So if you're close to deck out, or maybe you just want to have a constant booster, you can keep Shinri late game on the board if it comes up late game too. This is very important in the early game, especially if you're playing like a grade 2 game against other stride deck sets. This came out with Luard, this came out with Jet, especially with my Jet and Luard opponents on Friday for the Nexus event. I was going against Klaus with his Jet deck. We were grade 2 gaming for like 6 turns each. We're pretty much close to deck out almost, and then eventually get into like the Jet and all that stuff. Literally that game, I saw all 4 Shinris, that grade 2 gaming aspect of it, and it helped me really take advantage of that too. And then of course Luard, it came up one in here and there. What's difficult with Luard is that sometimes they have enough rearguards that now Shinri cannot get the extra power or even go into Soul because there's more than 1 rearguard, and so that was actually kind of annoying. So Chris actually did a good job at making sure he had 2 to 3 rearguards they're in the grade 2 gaming essentially. 310 Ray, so we have cards such as like Sword and Sun to re-abuse Shiranui. We have, of course, Shiranui to draw cards. Since I play 4 Peeling Dragons, I'm able to draw pretty consistently, and of course the Cycler, so I felt comfortable to still have 310 Ray. What I noticed about this deck is that your Counterblast is going to be used for Manga and Tenbu, and then any like your grade 2s or grade 1s that generate some type of advantage, and Tenrei is really one of those. And if you already have one, and if your opponent takes a dominated attack, you can have this bounce and just reuse it too. So as long as you see one, you have the option to actually use it, or just save your CB for later turns too. Sometimes if you try to use this too much, you can CB starve yourself in the next turn, and that's not good. So just be mindful of that. And for the Sentinels, 3 normal PG, and then the 1 Sanctitude. So we can take advantage of Sanctitude, so why not use it, especially against other Stride deck sets or other like triple drive decks. If not, it's just a normal PG at that point too. For the triggers, we are playing for the effect, so he doesn't always come up, but when he does come up, it's really making numbers with the first attack in late game, so it's kind of annoying when your opponent at first, like Furai is only so big, and then all of a sudden you have a 4K booster that reaches that next threshold, and they're like, oh, that's actually kind of annoying. And then of course you put it into Soul and Soul Blasted for the restanders too. So whenever he is needed, he is there to make those numbers, but also for those Soul. This is actually super vital against like the Prison matchup too, because this is your way to add Soul during your battle phase, so you just have enough to Soul Blast everything out by the time you end your turn too. Also forgot to mention with Sword and Sun, you can actually just call it from hand and Soul Charge. The CB cost comes after that too. So if you need to also have Soul against Prison or just generating Soul consistently, this guy is great for that too. So like you have a surplus of Soul that you can work with too. For more crits, normal crits, this is really just having more crit pressure. And I do play the draw triggers still, so multiple reasons. Consistency is key for me. I want to make sure that the deck gets its pieces throughout multiple rounds in a tournament. This was very important in both events. For example, Nexus was 6 rounds and they cut it off at that point for their Invitational, and then BCS was 7 rounds and then the top 32 cut essentially. So I didn't want to be in a position where my deck just bricked. And then also defensively, this helps a lot because you'll draw into more pieces or potentially into like some kind of shield value. I remember one game I drew into a PG and that actually made that turn a lot easier to guard without sacrificing so much hand. Grade 2 gaming, this is good because your opponent thinks you may be playing fronts, and the fronts can help, but they're not always a way to shift the tempo a little bit, especially if you're behind an advantage. Just damage checking or even drive checking a draw trigger can put you back in attrition, card advantage wise. And all of a sudden your opponent's like, man, they got something out of it, especially if you can call grade 2 or grade 1 body on the board and keep up the pressure too. The purple OT, so I've considered the red OT because if you think about it, the way you attack, you do restanders first and then your Vanguard and then restands them. So 9 times out of 10, the red OT would actually be really good because that gives you an extra attack because your Vanguard's still standing and they have already restood for their effects. That's true. However, with the purple OT, I really noticed that I tend to stay at very low damage in most games, especially in the early game. 0 to 1 ideally, sometimes 2 damage. If I'm already at 3 damage, I already feel kind of like risky. But that's all like the early to mid game. And then if you're still at low damage, you might be a damage less than your opponent and you might not heal from a normal heal trigger. But if you do drive check and OT, now you can just heal regardless of damage wise. And then of course you can get a card that's in the damage zone and add it to your hand. Shiranui that at this moment doesn't care about the drop zone. So then you can use the purple OT to grab pieces that are still in your damage zone. So if you do heal with other cards too, you just heal like, you know, triggers, things that don't really matter. And if you still happen to damage check like a Restander or an Aboro or a Sanctitude, you can leave those in your damage zone and have the purple OT fetch it for you if it does come up and if it's still in deck, right? Did it come up with me offensively? I want to say maybe once, but it was in the early game. So it wasn't super impactful. It was just another card, and it actually called another grade 2. I just called another Soaring Sun just to have a 4th attack on turn 2. This happened on Friday, but it wasn't like super like game changing. I had like 3 to 4, maybe 5 opponents between 2 days have a defensive OT. I think in all of them, it was in a situation where I was still able to adapt and be able to still win it, or I was already in a position where I was about to lose anyway. So them hitting a defensive OT doesn't matter. One did survive. It was Colin with Empoleon. He actually had 6 damage OT, 6 damage heal as well at one point. And it kept him in the game for another turn. I'm just like, wow, I can't seal the deal. And I might just lose on the clapback. But I was able to survive that and then still finish it the next turns. But Colin's a really good player too. He knew what he was doing too, so shout out to him. 3 normal heals and then 1 effect heal. Really of your choice. I still stuck with the restanding one. There's a couple of restanders, like Leonor's is a good example. We have the Shiranui Mare, we have rogue decks such as like Minerva, Varga, Greedon. Shoto Doji has interesting, like, it doesn't restand, it doesn't like have a great hire, it doesn't have gain crit. So you can't really have an effect heal that works well with Shoto Doji and then work with a lot of everything else. You can play the one that gains power from the crit gaining effect once. That's also good because some decks have like crit gaining abilities too. Into my matchups, I'll talk about Friday first, which was the Nexus Qualifier. So if you make it to top 16, you get an invitational to their like nationals level, which they still have to announce. I was fortunate and made it to top 16 and literally it was 16th place. Tiebreakers are horrible. I think like 5th place to 16 was like still X2, so depending on your tiebreaker, you could be 5th place or you could be like 16th place. The first was against a Lyrical deck. I don't really remember that. I apologize for that. The second round was Gears, and that was again against King of Vanguards, also known as Klaus, a good friend of mine too. So it was good to not only meet in person, but also just go against each other in an event too. That was a grind game. Like I said, we went grade 2 gaming for 6 turns and then finally went into the stride games. It came down to almost decking out, and I think I could have done a better play, but it was really tough to make the decision. I made the decision not to stride, but still have 3 attacks where my Vanguard could swing still, essentially. Realistically, if I were to look back, I think maybe you stride it into Magantembu and not swinging with the Vanguard on purpose and then try to outlast your next turn and then do the same thing again. Might have been the better play, but I have no idea. It was that close and it really came down to a trigger, and I knew I had 2 left in deck, I believe. And so if I drove check with my Vanguard, I was going to hit at least 1 or something like that. So I was like thinking of like those things as well. But again, shout out to Klaus for winning that one. Round 3 was the Yutsuba Nakuna deck. That's the Exodia deck. It was really me for the first time interacting with that deck too, and so I knew that I didn't have time. So I did call rearguards and they kept me at 0, and they would take advantage where they can attack a rearguard and get the drive checks later on. But I noticed that even during the mid to late game, I did not see no Ouroboros to be able to stride into Makuro. They were still in my deck at the end of the turn, or the end of the game, but luckily I was able to push through, and my opponent was very close. Like, he was at 12 quintuplets and he already had the 7 unique ones. He literally needed 2 more, so I think he needed the next turn to do that and still wait out another turn to activate the win condition. And I think his name was Paul. Shout out to him. I know we talked a couple times. Correct me if I'm wrong. The next round was Bastion. So this one went pretty fast. I think I hit a crit early on, so I put him in an awkward position. And then from it, because of the early aggression too, his turn 3, he only called 2 front row rearguards and called it a day. Of course, me using like the grade 2 or a Boro, I can't remember if I went first or second. I revived the grade 2 from his drop, and then Bastion Accord doesn't protect anything that's grade 2 or lower. So it didn't matter where he called that. And so I was able to dominate that still. And just because of his hand, he couldn't really guard effectively. And I pretty much won that turn. Round 5 was Apollio, the new deck from the set, against Colin. Again, Colin, like, back and forth. He knew what he was doing. It came down to him 6 damage healing and also no T healing, and then coming back on the clock back and trying to finish it out at that point too. One of the things that I did in that matchup was to still go aggro early on, and you want to give them damage sooner rather than later, because if they stay a low damage and you do your stride turns, if they take more damage during those turns, they get power regardless per damage by 5k, and then if a trigger goes off, that's even more. And then of course, if they reach the 4 more gauges, then at that point they just get super powered up, that it really just turns off your turn. So it's so vital to push in damage early on, so that way they have to really think about it later on. And then you force out like the usage of the grade 2. It's a big beater, but also they think about it as something that they can use as shield. Plus you can just dominate it and get rid of it with Magantembu. That's also a very key factor. So they can't just use it with the intercept. Again, shout out to Colin. Round 6 was against Luard against Chris. Chris was focused for that game. We were grade 2 gaming for a bit. He had the advantage at first. I thought I was going to lose, honestly. But he made 2 1-2 passes, and then each of those 1-2 passes, I broke it. One of them being a draw trigger, I vividly remember that, and putting me back in advantage. And I think he gave up first stride, and that gave me the tempo to go up in first stride and do my shenanigans. But he was able to deal an extra attack that still like sealed the deal against me. I couldn't guard everything essentially, so kudos to him. Then going into BCS Standard for Saturday, round 1 I was a buy because I had to buy a card since I won a shop challenge. Round 2 was against Varga, and so Varga, you want to keep them, you want to be cognizant of their counterblast availability. If they defend early on and you know you can damage deny them or just limit their CB, then you can do that early on. And then also if you can stay less than 4 damage, it really makes it difficult for their turn to really make an impact. I also try to get PGs too, just in case I need to just take a Divine Skill turn. At least I have PGs to guard everything. And then the following turn, they just can't take so many attacks from Shiranui as well. Round 3 was Dire Dolls, so that, again, you want to apply pressure early on, make it very difficult. You want to force them guarding with their bind, and also if you can get a card from their hand too. So if you can make those numbers work for you in the mid to late game, that actually makes it very difficult for them to just guard against efficiently, making their hand very small, and then eventually you just push through. Makes it difficult for them to even like Persona right later on too and have combo pieces at the same time. Round 4 was against Empoleon. That's this shout out to Lupe on Team Empire VGC. He had a more defensive build. He used Crank Vander and also the equivalent of Sweet Shop too, but he also had the Blitz Order that also reuses Grade 2, so he just have these guards later on that actually help guard against my high power crest attacks. We went back and forth. It was really close. In fact, in the mid game, I think I almost lost and he did the Divine Skill and I literally made it a 2 to pass because he was gonna get a crit more than likely. I'm already at 3 damage. If he gets it, he gets it at that point. But he only drove 1 trigger and I'm like, I'm still in this baby. And then we went back and forth and literally the last few turns it came down to driving an extra trigger to break enough shield value to get through. But I only get 1 for my triple drive and he was able to guard everything and then came back on the clapback. Especially, I think he had the grade 3 that also get a drive check. So I'm like, I'm super dead at that point. So shout out to him. The next one was Leonor. And so we went back and forth. He did Persona right, he had the Rosariums. It went back and forth, and I think I just was able to keep up and just win with normal domination stuff. But you had to you had to be strategic too. I think at one point, he healed back, and then he had like no CB left, and right when he was gonna do his normal grade 3 turn with Leonor, I damaged deny him, so he couldn't be able to draw an extra card and be able to like, oh, I can call and get an advantage. And it forced him to call more stuff from hand to have a smaller hand, and I think that might have helped like for the rest of the game to like him barely having a hand to defend against my domination attacks. Round 6, Yotsubu Nakuno again, and so this was again a grindy game. This time I was able to use Makuro, and Makuro actually made a difference, and I think it was either that turn or the next turn I was able to seal the deal. He was not having the best of luck. I think he only got to like maybe 7 quintuplets or maybe 9. Not as close as the other player did the prior night too, so he was just like, yeah, it happens. So it is what it is. Round 7 was Shotodoji against Michael, so we went back and forth. It was an interesting situation because he healed a couple times, and at one point, I think he was at 0 damage. So I know that I can't keep him at 0 damage too long because they'll just like really capitalize later on, because if they keep Persona riding, like their Shotodoji eject with the Suga Dachi coming out, like those attacks very scary, so they can get 6-7 attacks, just like we do. So I still push damage, and then I also intentionally attacked his rear guards, the key pieces one. So I also play Shotodoji, and I know that Shotodoji needs to commit a board at least 4 rear guards, and ideally the ones that you do need to do your turn. So if you're eliminating those key like Ojishis or like other units, it just like now they got to work into the drop zone, into the soul, into the buying, and like all these things too. And then also if you're able to force, you know, to use cards from the bind zone like the grade 1, especially if you push them in damage, then it just gets rid of those, so you're not so worried about that. So I was just very cognizant of the matchup where I can get some small wins and then push or hold back, and I was able to win that one too. And then lastly, into top 32, I faced Leonor, very good player too. His name is Trent, and it came down, like early game was really interesting. He was winning by advantage, but my drive checks were saving me. I think I hit a crit on turn 2, and that really turned the tables on him, and so he was in 3 to 4 damage. But then in the mid game, he actually healed back like 2 or 3 times. I think one of them was in damage, and then one of them was on the drive checks, and then he also had to draw a trigger, I think, or something that gave him an extra card. I couldn't remember. So it just kept him in the game, even though he was at higher damage at that point. And at the end, he had like 4 big attacks, Persona Ride, 2 Rosariums, and I'm like, I had 3 PGs, but that's all I got. After the, you know, I can't guard against the last 4 big attacks, essentially, and that was 6 damage for me. Overall, I'm very grateful, very humble, too, for the event. I would go again in the future. I don't know when, especially if the season's still going to May. But thanks again to the experience and all of the amigos that were there too, and I had a blast too. Let me know down in the comments below if you're excited for the new support for Shiranui later on with the order, and then eventually we'll get probably a new stride just like the other stride decks are getting soon too. So potentially I'll probably be still rocking this deck next year too. Until the next one, amigos. Bye!